Hi, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor at Providence College. This is an introductory lecture on ethics and its relationship between other normative endeavors, particularly law, religion, and economics. To give you the punchline here, the idea that I will be arguing for is that ethics is the primary category here, and that it always trumps law, religion, and economics in every aspect of our lives. The reason for that, we'll look at some historical reasons, of course, some everyday reasons, but the primary reason that we might think about is that if we want to live lives where we are prosperous in a self-fulfilling or self-actualizing way, then ethics is the proper category through which we must view all other questions. So to begin, we'll look at law compared to morality. So morality determines right and wrong. We use reason to determine what is right and wrong, and it applies for all time. In contrast, law determines right and wrong, but in a particular society. So the law for the United States is going to be different from the law for the United Kingdom, which is different than the law that is in Russia. So these laws are determined according to the political leaders or the legislators or according to some agreement with the people. It can be revised for new circumstances, but we can always judge the law according to the moral system. So we can think of various ways in which we have judged the law in the past, and we'll talk about those in just a second. One way that we've judged the law is its way to support autonomy. So if you have watched my previous lecture on why be moral, you know that it's important to exercise autonomy in order to be able to live a life that we can be proud of. Obviously, laws that support the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are important for maintaining autonomy. If we do not have a right to life, then our life can be taken away at any time, and we cannot be autonomous from the person who can take away our life. Same thing with liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But law can also inhibit or prevent autonomy. So under slavery, obviously the law prevented certain groups of people from exercising autonomy. And so they were not morally culpable. They weren't even able to develop a sense of morality in some sense. We might say the same things under Jim Crow laws. Or today we might talk about the way that the law protects Monsanto. So Monsanto is a company that has developed a particular corn seed. They plant their corn seed. If that seed flies through the wind onto another person's property and infects that person's corn, Monsanto finds out about it, and then they get to demand that that person pays them for the seed and for all future crops, because now that person's crop has been contaminated by Monsanto. Monsanto says that the person is stealing their property because they designed the seed, even though we all know that it was the wind that caused the seed to fly over there. So in that way, Monsanto is protected by the law. And so that prevents the autonomy of people who own small farms and cannot afford the same number of lawyers that Monsanto can to defend their property rights. So what we're getting to here is the idea that morality evaluates the rightness and wrongness of law. The laws that justified slavery, the laws under Jim Crow, were wrong laws. As Martin Luther King Jr. would say in his letter from Birmingham Jail, because they did not uplift human personality, they were unjust laws, which are no laws at all. And Thomas Aquinas says this as well in his Summa Theologica. And so you can look those up on your own time. Some ways that we might evaluate the rightness and wrongness of law is, of course, through autonomy, but there might be other criteria through which we might evaluate the law as well. Let's look then at the relationship between morality and economics. Again, morality is a code of right and wrong that addresses all of human life. It is determined by reason, and it's supposed to lift up or improve the life of the individual person. Economics, on the other hand, is a code of right and wrong that addresses only the economic aspects of life. Now, in living in the 21st century, we might think that economics is everything there is to life. And certainly the news media and the law and Congress that we have today try to convince us that every decision should be made according to the determination of how it affects our economy. But of course, many of us would recognize that there's more to life than just economy. We talk to your friends and your neighbors and your family. At a certain point, they'll recognize that, say, family is more important than economics. Economics is also determined by economic forces and not by reason, and so can be irrational. And the purpose of economics is to lift up the economy, not to lift up the individual. And so we see again that morality is a broader category and one through which we would rightly judge an economic situation. So again, economics sometimes supports autonomy when resources are directed to developing the human potential. And it may also allow the freedom of choice within the market. Those are good things, of course. But we might also recognize that for the most part, economics does not support autonomy. In fact, economics, particularly in our world, tends to dominate other aspects of human life. We are familiar with, of course, many, many cases in which economics has failed to support autonomy and has actually caused human life to be worse. One of the most famous cases is the Ford Pinto case. This is a situation in which Ford Pinto learned that the placement of the gas tank in the Pinto was in a situation where it would cause explosions. And so they did an economic analysis of whether it would be more cost effective to move the gas tank where it would not explode, or rather to pay out the health insurance policies for those people who would be burned or even killed by the explosion in the Pinto. It would have cost $11 to move the gas tanks in each Pinto. But rather than using that process, they determined that it was cheaper to pay out health insurance policies for those who were burned and killed. And so Ford Pinto chose to place their economic bottom line above the life of each human being. We also see the same thing in the 2007 financial crisis. If you have not watched it, I recommend that you watch The Big Short, and it tells you exactly how many people place the drive of the economy over the life of individual people. If we go back to one of the primary founders and theorists about the capitalist society, Adam Smith, he also says that the worker is often forced to submit to the capitalist because the worker cannot do without the capitalist as long as the capitalist can do without the worker. And so the worker is often lacking autonomy and the ability to direct his or her life within a capitalist situation. Many of you, of course, know this either through your own jobs or through family members who have had to make sacrifices in their family life in order to keep their job, or to make immoral decisions in order to keep their job. And so we treat economics as though it's more important than morality. But in the end, what we see is that most people who make those decisions end up having less autonomy and end up causing sacrifices that they would not normally accept. Now we can move on to a comparison between philosophical ethics and theological ethics. Philosophy, of course, is simply the love of wisdom. Specifically, it entails a reflection on and consideration of one's basic beliefs about life, death, eternity, and the universe. We do this primarily through reason, and we have a long tradition of philosophy across many cultures. Theology is primarily the study of God, and specifically it concerns God as revealed in religion, or in a specific religion, and more generally a study of the different beliefs of that religion. So theology we typically think of as coming from outside of us. Philosophy we typically think of as coming from within us. Theology is requiring an interpretation of the revelation, and philosophy is based upon the interpretation of what other people have said and using our reason to come to an understanding of that. Now, when we think about philosophical morality versus religious ethics, we see that both are about beliefs about right and wrong. And the main difference is that morality is going to be based on human reason, whereas theological ethics will be based primarily on faith. So here within religion, we have a set of beliefs about a deity or a universe which drives all of our other beliefs. And when we examine a moral situation, we particularly examine it from a particular religious perspective. So what someone believes about, say, abortion or about euthanasia will derive primarily from their beliefs about Christianity, if they're Christian, or their beliefs about Islam, if they're a Muslim. And so faith becomes primary here. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no room for reason within the faith commitment, but it does mean that reason often is subordinated to the faith principles, whereas within philosophical morality, reason is the trump card. So it's a different way of looking at what we might be doing in our lives and trying to figure out how best to move forward here. I'm not arguing particularly that any religion is bad for doing any of the sorts of things that we might think about. What I am trying to say in this lecture is that we often come to the realization that morality, from a philosophical perspective, can judge the morality of religious ethics. So, when we think about theological or religious ethics, sometimes, of course, it can support autonomy. So we notice that throughout human history, but particularly throughout the history of the United States, religious movements have been at the forefront of civil rights movements. It was a religious movement that ended or began the march to end slavery. It was a religious movement that helped bring about women's suffrage, a religious movement that helped in Jim Crow laws, and we believe that it will be a religious movement that helps us to finally address the environmental crisis. And religious leaders generally focus on healing individuals in many cases, the church sex abuse scandal aside, of course. But of course, theological ethics sometimes inhibits autonomy, right? So it doesn't offer any support for those who do not believe in their religious perspective. And in many cases, it doesn't give us any guidance in certain situations. And finally, we might see that religious statements may conflict. So we know that within the Bible, there are various arguments about punishing people who've violated us and loving those who are our enemies. And we see different sorts of conflictual statements within the Quran or within the Hindu Vedas. So there's not one interpretation for these different documents. And these conflicts are difficult to resolve based simply on religious principles. And finally, the primary reason that philosophical morality is a trump card over theological ethics is because religion cannot determine whether one has been told to do something by God or a deity of some sort. In other words, if we think that someone has been told to do something that God has spoken to them, we have to ask, well, how do we know that that person is doing the right thing? How do we know that God has really spoken to them? And the only basis that we have for making those judgments is to go back to our reason and ask whether this is something that really supports human life and human autonomy. Does religion or ethics have a role in the moral debate in society and in social policy? Of course it does. We have examples where it hasn't worked well, and so we have a situation of pluralism today. And we know about the religious wars, but it's often a question about whether those wars were actually motivated by differences in religion or whether it was motivated by attempts at land and economic control. And there's some history to suggest that it was more about religion being used as an excuse for the expanse of power. But we also know that religion has made positive contributions. It gives a starting point and it foregrounds social liberties because it's based on, in many cases, respect for all peoples and also on a principle of peace. So my argument is not that religion has no role within public policy debates, but that we have to balance that religious or theological view with what we also know from reason. So when we think about making moral arguments, we have to think about where our reason comes into play, where religious beliefs might support the arguments from reason, to be respectful of a pluralistic audience, to be mindful of history, and to respect other religious views.